This talk will be slightly different from anything you may have heard or will hear at the rest of the Psychic Faire, because I'm sorry, but we're doing pure science. We're doing mathematics and physics in here. So this, as I said, I see one person out there that has a sign. He is doing the science of spirituality. There's no such thing as the science of spirituality. Spirituality and science are technically at odds with each other. And I know a lot of people in spirituality would be offended by seeing the science of spirituality, because science reduces everything, yet spirituality is an all enveloping type of thing. So I find that when I go to psychic fairs, and people at psychic fairs are in general very receptive to me, because I am trying to do science and mathematics, very strict science and mathematics. And I always see people who are doing the quantum theory of spirituality or something, quantum spirituality, and the two don't mix. They don't have anything to do with each other, as I said. People in spirituality, some of the psychic realms, take offense when science tries to interfere. Now, I am a paraphysicist. That is the physics equivalent of a parapsychologist. Well, a parapsychologist will study the phenomena of the paranormal: mind reading, telekinesis, psychokinesis, clairvoyance, remote viewing, everything. A physicist will look at the causes of it, how it actually works. So I deal with how the paranormal actually works. And that includes mediumship, which is not a question for scientists. For scientists, we don't deal with mediumship. We deal with something called the survival of consciousness. And basically, it's the survival of consciousness that I'm talking about. You've seen mediums like John Edward on TV, everyone? And at the beginning of his show, they say something to the effect that, and John Edward has been studied at university and has been found to be real. Well, there is some truth in that statement. He was studied by Gary Schwartz out of Tucson. Let me see, I can't remember, I think that's Arizona State rather than the University of Arizona. And Schwartz wrote a few books on the afterlife experiments. And Gary Schwartz found that John Edward and a few other people were accurate about 80% of the time with their predictions under laboratory conditions. You know, with blinds, they were trying to read people who were totally unknown to anybody, including the scientists, so it couldn't be telepathy or anything. And so Schwartz and a few of the scientists working with him fully concur that something must survive death. Now, and Gary Schwartz will tell you it's not the statistical validity of that, but the 80% correct, however you grade. So, because different people get different percentages depending on how they grade John Edwards and Bob James Van Prague's results. It's every once in a while there's something very startling. They come up with something very startling, and as long as they're not faking, there's no work with the people they're reading beforehand to set up the scientists, cheating, as we say. They get very startling results sometimes. I know I saw John Edward on TV one time, and he kept on telling the woman that a dog was coming through. And she said, well, I never owned a dog in my life. Then, well, you check with your relatives. There's a dog coming through. Its name is something like Cashew or Peanut or something like that. And she went and sat down, and one of the people in the audience, she came back 15 minutes later, and one of her relatives in the audience said, yeah, when she was a little girl, she had a dog named Peanut. And that is so far beyond probability that something's going on there. If there's not collusion to cheat beforehand, then there's absolutely something going there. But there's a lot more evidence for survival of consciousness. In particular, a gentleman by the name of Ian Stevenson at Virginia Tech. He has done research into reincarnation. And I consider this the best scientific evidence that consciousness survives death. He studied young people who have stories of previous lives. And when somebody's 3, 4, 5 years old, 6 years old, they talk about sometimes their previous life. And then they start forgetting it as they grow older, as they're acclimated to our culture. Because our culture does not accept this and says it's bad, so they're made to forget. Basically, it becomes part of the subconscious rather than the conscious mind. And one young boy that he interviewed was born with a very strange mottled birthmark. It was a very strange pattern on his chest. And the boy remembered his previous life. He had been a man. He had been killed in a shotgun blast, a murder. And he knew the name of the man, gave it to Ian Stevenson. Ian Stevenson found the man with the correct name, got the coroner's report with a very exact detail of where the shot had entered his body. And the 12 pieces of shot exactly matched the birthmark on the child's chest. I consider that irrefutable evidence that something's going on. But science doesn't really recognize Ian Stevenson's work. That's the most startling of the cases he's had. Now the question of science is, when we have evidence like this, observations, we want to build a hypothesis or theory to explain. Well, normally science doesn't even deal with death. Biologists, by very definition, biologist or a doctor deals with life and doesn't care about death. They care about the dying, how you die, but beyond life, they don't care. Well, as a physicist, I have developed a theory of what happens when we die. And I would like to guarantee you, I'm 99.999% sure, I can't verify it yet. They've given a nice grant, which I'll never get. And a group of scientists, I can verify that we survive. The consciousness survives in a period of 5 to 10 years. But I expect that during my lifetime, my theoretical work will not be accepted. If it's on the internet, it's going to live forever. They'll rediscover my work, unless one of my students carries on for me. I'll put him on the spot. Now, I am working in a theory that's called Einstein-Kaluza theory. And it is basically, this is an accepted theory. It's well known. If you've heard anything about superstring theory, seen specials on superstring theory on television, they work from a Kaluza-Klein theory. It's another scientist, Oscar Klein, made a variation of theory. So we're working from the same basis, I and superstring theory, but their model of the universe and reality is quite different from mine. They take 10 or 11 dimensions to explain the structure of our universe, the geometric structure of our universe. I only use 5. The original Einstein-Kaluza theory only uses 5 dimensions. And of course, Einstein's theory explains gravitation. Then, combined with Kaluza's theory, it explains electromagnetism and gravitational theory. Basically, between electricity, magnetism, and gravitation, it explains the geometry of the whole universe. The geometry, everything in the universe, is a mixture of these 3. Because electric and magnetic forces hold tables and objects together. Then tables and objects have gravitational attractions. Then gravity holds the universe together as a whole. So this is called the geometry of the universe, and this explains it. But it takes a 5-dimensional space-time. Now, classical space has 3 dimensions. Then in early Einstein theory, the 4th dimension is time. So when we have space-time, we have 4-dimensional space-time. But Kaluza-Klein theory adds another dimension to this. Now, we do not sense, we never sense this 5th dimension in the way that we sense our normal 4 dimensions. Because our regular 4-dimensional space-time, 3 dimensions, height, width, and depth. The common 3-dimensional space we live in, and a 4th dimension, are constituted by material bodies. So all material bodies exist in this 4-dimensional space-time. Now that means when we see in 4-dimensional space-time. When we feel, when we smell, when we hear, when we taste, we're working in 4-dimensional space-time. So all of our five senses operate within this four-dimensional space-time. So that's what we're used to. Now we can only imagine what the fifth dimension is like. It's a purely mathematical concept. It's a purely mathematical concept. That's the only way we can attack it, understand what it is. But if there is a fifth dimension, and the Einstein-Kaluza theory says there is, then it would affect everything in the universe, how everything in the universe works. It is my contention, applying the Einstein-Kaluza theory, that we are extended in this fifth dimension. And in this five-dimensional extension, we have a sixth sense. And this is where all the paranormal phenomena occur. Now, what is this fifth dimension? This fifth dimension is a field. I call it simply the single field. Einstein didn't call it single field, he called it unified field. So his theory was unified field theory. My extension of it is single field theory. Now it's a single field. It is physical but non-material because matter is limited to four-dimensional space-time. So this is the field that comes before matter. Now we all have an idea of what field is. Everything in the universe, as far as we know, is composed of two things: matter and field. Matter is denoted by mass. In the gravitational field, the mass has weight. Now, you would all say that this table is pretty solid, wouldn't you? Would you say my hand is pretty solid? This is common 8th grade science. My hand is 99.999% empty space. Empty of matter. Empty of matter. When I say empty space, vacuum. This table is 99.9999% empty of matter. So technically, if matter is the only thing, I can put my hand right through the table. I can walk right through that wall. But I can't. Why can't I? Well, matter is made up of atoms. Atoms have a small, very, very dense nucleus. Then electrons are way far away. If I take a single atom, say a hydrogen atom is the smallest. You've got a little tiny proton in the center, orbiting with an electron orbiting around it. This is how much empty space there is. If that proton in the center of my hydrogen atom is that size, that electron would be orbiting out on the highway. That would all be empty space between the two. The next atom would be that far away again. That's why I say it's 99.9% empty of matter. So the question, why can't my hand pass through the table? What do we sense as solidity? It's not, we don't sense as solidity the matter in this. We weigh this, and yes, we can get matter. The gravitational field pulls the matter on this, and that's what we call weight. But really, what it is between the proton and electron, between everything, there are electric forces. Basically what we call electrostatic electricity. When you see sparks, when you put something in dryer, forget to put in your little sheet, softener sheet, and you have two synthetic sweaters and you try and pull them apart, you get sparks this long. That's static electricity. That is exactly what's holding matter together. So, I can't put my hand through this table because the electrostatic field here repels my hand. We see this as solid because light is an electromagnetic wave that reflects off of this field, and so I see it. So what we see is not exactly what there is. It's all fields. When I put this piece of chalk here and drop it, it falls because it is in the gravitational field. Have any of you ever played with magnets? I take North Pole magnet, and I try and push them together. As they get closer and closer, it's harder and harder. There's something pushing against it, but there's nothing there. Nothing material there. It's the magnetic field that does that. So fields are real. We feel them all the time, but we're used to them so we don't sense them. Well, that's in four-dimensional space-time. In four-dimensional space-time, you have gravity, electrical fields, and magnetic fields, and matter. But in five-dimensional theory, these are just different ways that the single field manifests itself. If we could see our four-dimensional world from a five-dimensional perspective, first of all, we'd be totally outside of time because time is in four dimensions. So if we could go to fifth dimension, we'd see all of time in one shot. We'd be outside of time. We'd see time in an instant. Gee, isn't that what the mystics talk about? It already fits in physics very well. We'd be in a single field, and our four-dimensional space-time will look like a very cloudy sheet, very thin, cloudy sheet. And some places the clouds fold over. Well, the clouds fold over, those are protons, and neutrons, and electrons. How the field reacts, relates within itself, this big four-dimensional space-time sheet reacts, that's what gives us matter. Matter is folds and bends in the sheet. Gravity, electric, and magnetic forces are just manifestations of a single field within the sheet due to the characteristics of a single field. Now this is hard to imagine. Very hard to imagine. Now, you have to imagine this higher dimension using geometry, simple geometry. For example, this is a flat surface. This is a flat surface. If I draw a triangle on this flat surface, the three angles of the triangle always add up to 180 degrees. Simple geometry we learned in junior high school. But that's not always true. If I take a sphere, and I draw a triangle on a sphere, if I go from this corner to the North Pole, from the North Pole back to the equator, and from the equator back to that point, basically I've cut out an eighth of that sphere. Those are all straight lines, but the three angles are 90, 90, 90. So the three angles add up to 270 degrees. See, geometry on this surface, because this is a two-dimensional surface that's curved in a higher dimension. On a flat two-dimensional surface, three angles add up to 80 degrees. Or 180 degrees. That's what Euclid said a few thousand years ago. That's always accepted until 150 years ago when they discovered other geometries. Now, by making an analogy, how a two-dimensional surface is different when it's curved in a higher space, if we consider our four-dimensional space-time as a curvature in a five-dimensional space, which is what relativity theory does anyhow, and then inclusive time theory makes that. By analogy, we can imagine what a fifth dimension would be like. For example, if I have a two-dimensional sheet, and I'm a three-dimensional being, and they're little beings, little two-dimensional beings in this two-dimensional sheet. This is something that's written in a book called Flatland by Abbott in 1883, I think it was. So this is very old mathematics. If I have a two-dimensional sheet, and I'm a three-dimensional being. Suppose there are little two-dimensional beings in that sheet. And I stick my finger through the sheet. They wouldn't see my whole finger. What would they see? They just see a little slice of my finger. And they'd see my finger. If I put my hand in there, they'd see a big oval. And if I draw it out, the oval changes right before their eyes. And the oval becomes a different shape, until it becomes a small oval. And finally what they see is a point. But their perspective would be that was like magic. It was a paranormal event. But from my higher perspective, three dimensionals, to me it's not paranormal, it's just normal. By analogy, what's happening to us in a single field, everything is made of a single field that we sense in light. But events in the single field do not look the same from the five-dimensional perspective as they do from the three-dimensional perspective. Now we are all extended fifth direction. Now this is the weird thing about it. Because where is our five-dimensional self? We define consciousness. The only definition of consciousness that we have is it's a recognition of self. That we can take and look in a mirror and see ourselves, and we know it's ourself as separate from the rest of the universe. That's the only real definition they have. Now, there are very few other animals that can do that. Monkeys can do it, some higher apes can do it. They don't know if dolphins can or not. Recognize themselves. So self-recognition is a primary requirement for a human-like consciousness. And I'll say human-like because I'm not going to say if there are other consciousnesses or not. Now, we recognize ourselves in a sense because we are localized in a four-dimensional space-time. So when we see our reflection, that's ourself. That says we have consciousness. Well, what would our self be? What would our five-dimensional self be? Where is our five-dimensional? If I say all matter is extended in this fifth dimension, where is it? Well, it's outside of us, in a sense, because it's outside of our material body. But at the same time, this is a weird thing. So our five-dimensional self is outside of our body, but at the same time it's also inside our body. Why? Because every mathematical point in our body, every mathematical point in all in space and time is extended. If this is a four-dimensional sheet, every mathematical point is extended around like this and loops back on itself. So while we're like those little two-dimensional beings here stuck in a sheet, we're just in a bigger sheet. We're in a four-dimensional sheet. Our material bodies are in that four-dimensional sheet, as well as our five senses are within that sheet. So we never sense anything out normally. We never sense everything in the fifth dimension. But out here in the five-dimensional extension, we're all connected to each other because we're all part of the same single field. Now I can build this up logically from this structure. I can build up and say exactly what life is. Life comes from the chemical reactions that go on in our body. And what happens is the chemical reactions cause our material bodies and sheet days, they cause to go up and down as they change energies. Any chemical reaction will do that because of change in speed, Einstein's theory of special relativity. It will make particles that will point up and down. A particle, a proton would just look like my finger sticking up above the sheet like that. But it would be so small we couldn't see it. Now, as a proton gains speed, it rises up. As it loses speed, it goes down. So in chemical reactions, the chemicals, electrons, and the atoms are going up and down in fifth dimension. Sort of like a pattern, like this, going up and down in fifth dimension. They form a pattern and interlock. When you have different chemical reactions forming a specific pattern, that pattern is life itself. So life is a field density variational pattern. Life is a field density variational pattern in the single field. So we're just like patterns. We're field density patterns in five-dimensional space. Now, just to show you that this is science, in April, I'm going to be going to an international conference on consciousess in Tucson, Arizona. And I'm going to give the same talk to them I'm giving right now. But I'm just going to put it in more highfalutin scientific terms. So this is something I'm telling you. I mean, I go in front of top-notch, world-class scientists and do the same talk, roughly the same talk. But I'm going to go and I'm going to give them all the little details on how this works, but I'm not giving it to you. So you're getting a legitimate scientific talk here. Now that's all life is a field density pattern, variational pattern. The more complex, the more evolved the life, the more complex the pattern. Now I'm talking about I'm talking about here, life, you know, the primordial ooze things that first becomes life. This is evolution, this is the physics of evolution also. I hope everyone here has no problems with evolution, because this is also physics of evolution. You have a blob, and that blob is connected 5-dimensionally through the single field. And it's this pattern. It interacts with its environment. It absorbs new chemical reactions to grow, so it grows more and more complex over time, just by interacting with its environment. You know, heat, cold, lightning, different chemicals it comes in contact. So it becomes more complex. Finally, as it becomes more complex, it grows a skin to protect it from the environment. It starts differentiating inside of itself. Eventually, it keeps on differentiating until what? It has different organs. It specializes in the differentiation. So it has organs which are like sub-patterns within the overall life pattern. But when it develops, when it gets to the point where it develops different organs, skin, muscles, bone, for different living functions in interaction with the environment, it becomes so complex that life really can't, the life pattern can't really control it. So it develops a special organ. What is that special organ? That develops to control body functions and everything. The brain. So in our, first of all, we have the life pattern. We have the life pattern in 5-dimensional single field that corresponds to our material chemical reactions that make life. Then after it evolves, you get a secondary. Well, you get a secondary pattern, field density pattern, sort of a pattern on top of a pattern. But that pattern on top of a pattern corresponds to the material development of the brain as a controlling agent. Now we have a name for this secondary pattern. Mind. Mind is a secondary pattern, sort of a pattern on a pattern that controls all the chemical reactions in our body. So mind corresponds to brain. Mind acts through brain, but mind and brain are two different things. Mind is actually an extension of the whole body, and a lot of scientists now are arguing that mind, whatever it is, corresponds to the whole body, not to the brain. So some scientists agree with me in this respect, although they wouldn't agree with my theory. Now, the mind continues to develop by making choices. Mind continues to develop by storing memories. And what are memories? Patterns. They're just patterns. Well, where are memories stored? A lot of scientists now believe that memories can't be stored in the brain because the brain just isn't big enough. I agree with them. Memories are not stored in the brain. The brain is actually a big radio transmitter receiver. Or rather, the individual neurons in the brain are radio transmitters. And this is what I show at conferences I give, how an individual neutron, actually a little something called microtubule within a neuron in the brain, and the axon of the brain acts as a radio transmitter. So it transmits memory. Where is memory stored? Well, memory is stored as a pattern. It's part of the mind pattern. So memory is actually stored in our 5-dimensional extension. So I have to explain memory. Now, the reason I go to this explanation, the reason scientists don't think memory is stored in the brain, because the brain isn't big enough. How many of you use a digital camera? Okay, you use a digital camera and you take a picture, right? And say 3.2 megapixels. That's 3.2 million bits of memory used. And I don't get a picture, or you don't get a picture of this much of the board. That's 3.2 megapixels. And it wouldn't be near, you couldn't even read the writing on the board. It wouldn't be distinct enough. Think of it. Your eyes, how much eyes in 1 second, how many megapixels of memory does your brain use in 1 second of sight? Well, 3.2 would just give you an unclear picture of the board. Yet you see with your peripheral vision and everything. You see with a certain clarity. Right now, as I look at you, with everything I can see within my field of vision, I say that's probably about not 3 million pixels, more like 3 trillion pixels. That's for a still shot. in order to maintain continuity of movement, I'd have to do, I think, like 30 still shots a second. That's what we see movies at, 30 shots a second. So all of a sudden, for 1 second of sight, I'm talking about 30,000 or 30 million trillion pixels of memory. When I put a whole life in there, there's not enough atoms in your brain to store all that. If every atom is a different, if we can store somehow on the atomic level, I've already upped the number of atoms in your brain just for what you see during your lifetime. Our memories can't be stored in our brain. It just doesn't have enough memory. For me, for 5 seconds of my sight, if I were to store that on computers, it would take all the memory in all the computers in the world to do 5 seconds of what I see. That's phenomenal. All that can't fit in our brain. It has to be stored someplace else. A lot of scientists now are coming to that conclusion by analogies with computers. So our brains can't store all of our memories. So where are they? Well, they're in this 5-dimensional pattern. Why? Because our 5-dimensional pattern, where we are extended from our 4-dimensional space-time sheet in the 5th dimension, our pattern, our extension for each and every one of us is as big as the whole universe in that 5th direction. That's a lot of storage space, isn't it? That's why we can have such great memories. And then we're like a little radio transmitter receiver. Our brain is like a special radio transmitter that can pick that out of the pattern and bring it back into cause the chemical reactions in our brain that we call recognition of memories when we remember things. I don't know of any place else where that much memory can be stored. But that's a quickie of my theory of how memory works. But through evolution, then we have mind, and then we have storing memories. Those memories cause patterns. Those memories cause patterns. Now eventually, those patterns in our mind, in the our 5-dimensional extension, become so complex that they start making connections. Patterns within patterns. At that time, we develop a 3rd level. A pattern on a pattern on a pattern. The first pattern is life. Then we have a much finer, complex pattern, mind. Then we have a much finer, complex pattern due to the storing of memories. 3rd level pattern. By the way, this pattern is magnetic, because that's what 5th dimension is. It deals more with magnetism. It's more like magnetism than either gravity or electricity. And how do we store memory in computers and things? On audio tapes and everything? Magnetically. Aha! We're just repeating what our mind is already doing in 5-dimensional space. I can actually show that in physics, why it's 5-dimensional, in standard electromagnetic theory. But it's a 3rd level pattern. Now, as mind evolves, the first thing we note, a simple organism would see this room and think all of reality is this room. When it moves in the hallway, all reality is just what it senses at the time. But as we evolve, we learn that reality extends beyond the room. There's a Psychic Faire going on next door. Australia is on the other side of the world. There's a man in the moon. We learn through experience that there is a space or something beyond our immediate sensory perception. Now, in physics, we call that localization. We localize. We distinguish between local space and non-local space, which would be the whole environment we can't sense at any given time. Then, because of these stored memory patterns, then we learn that there's a time, non-local time. The non-local time is called past and future. We develop a sense of history, the flow of time. That, I had a childhood. The childhood is someplace. I have a future. The future is someplace. So we localize ourselves in time. In other words, we learn through our memory patterns and experience from our 5 senses. We learn to localize ourselves in 3-dimensional space and time, as separate from our environment. When that happens, when we can think of ourselves locally in space and time as separate from everything else that we know of in the universe through our memories, we develop that 3rd level pattern. and that is called consciousness. That is our consciousness. Now, what did I say? The only scientific acceptable explanation of consciousness. Science cannot define consciousness at this time. The closest thing they have to define consciousness or realizing consciousness, what it is you distinguish self. Okay, when you localize yourself in space and time relative to the non-local space, now the Australians were there 100 years ago on the bottom side of the planet, things like that. That's not local. What is that? Self is a localization of yourself in space and time, in the physics sense. So I agree with that definition. So I'm going out on a limb. I think I'm the only scientist in the world now that can explain what consciousness is and how to define it. I've done this in front of audiences, scientific audiences too. They generally accept what I do, but then go out and forget it afterwards. Now, there are some scientists who are interested in this. But now I've defined life, mind, and consciousness as evolving patterns. As evolving patterns. Now, this is about death. I contend there can be no science of death until we have a science of life. And as of today, I don't know of anyone else that has a science of life, an explanation of what life is. Yet it's our patterns in the five-dimensional field. So now that I have a theory of life, mind, and consciousness, I can answer the question on survival of consciousness. Picture it this way. The green board, this green board is our four-dimensional space-time. The pattern of writing on the board is what? Well, that would be life. The pattern, the overall pattern is life. But the individual letters would be the secondary pattern, that's memories. But if we look at it more closely, what are the individual letters made out of? Little bits of chalk dust, a much finer pattern. So the chalk dust is a third level consciousness. The individual letters are the words, mine. The overall pattern of what I've written on the board is life itself. Then the three-dimensional green blackboard, or black-green board, whatever it is the space-time continuum, four-dimensional space-time continuum. Now, what happens when we die? The chemical reactions stop. Right in our body. That's a good definition of death. All the chemical, electromechanical stop. So what happens is that disrupts the life pattern. That disrupts the life pattern. It scatters the letters. But what is still left? Mind and consciousness are still left. The individual letters lose their connection to the board. It's like I could take the green board away, and the individual letters would still be there with the chalk dust that makes them. Mind and consciousness survive death. Separated from our four-dimensional body. Now, mind and consciousness survive death as a mutually coherent. Coherence means working together. If things aren't working together in physics, they decohere, just scramble, scatter. But I contend that the consciousness pattern holds the mind pattern together, and the mind pattern holds the consciousness pattern together. So they then form a being, a specialized pattern in five-dimensional space-time that is disconnected from our four-dimensional space, the discarnate body, without material body. So I contend this is what we are when we die. Our mind and consciousness survive. Then if you want to look at Stevenson's work, for some reason it comes back and affects the newborn baby until then the baby grows up, remembers its past experiences, until acculturation says that can't be true, so just suppresses it. And so this theory fits very well. Now Part of the thing in science is you have to have prediction. What can predict this here? Well, I can predict what happens when we die. When we die, you're disconnected from your body, right? Your four-dimensional space-time body. Oops. There go your five senses. How do you define self in 5 dimensions? Well, the consciousness, your consciousness is a very, very fine pattern, and it can detect disturbances in the single field. This is just a pattern within the field. The whole universe is a single field. Consciousness is so fine, it can detect, variations in ether, as a psychic would say. Well, it's not ether, it's a single field. Well, we detect those. It can distinguish itself. If you're enlightened enough during life, if you know what's going on in life, when you die, your self remains, but this is your new self. Now, when you die, your sixth sense is basically coming through consciousness back to mind. Your mind, when you die, has always taken in data through your 5 senses. It doesn't get data through the 5 senses. So what does it do? In a sense, it starts searching. Your consciousness then becomes your new sense organ in 5-dimensional space-time. So your mind continues to grow in a sense. If you know what's going on before you die, if you really, if you're a caveman or something, nothing's going to happen because you don't have that much of a concept of self, so when you die, the concept of self doesn't carry over. But if you're smart enough during life, if you know enough, if you have enough knowledge and this pattern is strong enough, you realize yourself when you die. When that interacts with our 4-dimensional space-time, we call it a ghost or an apparition. But otherwise, it's there. And when John Edwards, I don't say John Edwards is real or not. I don't say any medium is real or not. I say that when someone like John Edwards does this mediumship thing, that is more what I would expect from my theory a medium to say. So he acts like a real one. I don't know if he's faking it or not, but that type of thing. Now, the first thing you do, your mind wants input. Now, give me input, like one of the computer things in Science 5. I want input, give me input. The only input it can get from consciousness. So what does consciousness do? It searches what's most familiar. And what's most familiar? Your own memories. So consciousness looks at your own memories. During near-death experience, that's called the past life review. When it sees the past life review, it realizes self. So then it starts looking outward for input. Now your input, again, your sixth sense, your consciousness is the organ of your sixth sense. So it looks outward. And what does it see? Everything in 5-dimensional space-time all at the same time. It's outside of time. Time is not a reality there. You're outside of the 4-dimensional space-time, so you're literally outside of time. You see eternity. You sense eternity. Mind-boggling. If you're not prepared for it, you see nothing. Blackness or heaven. If you did bad things during your life, what do you see? You start reliving those bad things. You create your own hell. Be assured, Hitler and people like that are suffering every little bit of thing they cause to other people. I can explain that in more detail how that works. But they are. You experience your past life. And if you led a bad past life, a wrong past life, one that does not match the rest of the universe in knowledge or deeds, then you're stuck with that for all eternity. You're stuck in it. As I said, you create your own hell. But if you're advanced enough, you sense the whole universe, you realize what it is. What would you sense? What you sense everything all at the same time. And what fills everything in reality? What fills every point in this room right now? Every point, every mathematical point in all of space-time, what's it filled with? Electromagnetic waves, light. So when you first take that trip outside yourself, mind-body, you would sense light. Well, what is the combination of all colors of visible light? White. but you're sensing all electromagnetic waves, the whole spectrum, from cosmic rays down to the longest wavelengths. Those frequencies, you sense them all. So you see this super brilliant, or you would sense, see, we don't see, we don't have eyes. You would sense this brilliant white light. And what do people in near-death experiences say? They sense it. They're sensing the fifth dimension. In a near-death experience, they're realizing their connection with the rest of the universe through their sixth sense. It's just simple logic deducted from a geometrical model of five-dimensional space-time. Then what happens? Well, then they go, they spread out and start detecting things out there. So what else would they detect out there? Other mind consciousnesses. Parents and people who thought. So I can pretty much explain with this model. I can explain everything's sensed during near-death experiences. That's my first line of verification, scientific verification. But I can also explain to some extent why reincarnation and other things. So enough to support Ian Stevenson's. So, I'll open it up for questions now. But I would like to assure you, I am 99.999% sure as I can be in science. Pure science. Einstein's stuff, not crap science, not pop science. This is the real theory, Einstein proves it. I can give you the scientific references for this in scientific journals, if you want. With 99.999% assured, I can assure you that our mind and consciousness survive. And just the fact that you are here today, listening to me talk, I'm already preparing you for that eventuality. Which is my purpose. To prepare everyone for this eventuality. One other thing. The original work on near-death experience, what's his name? He wrote the original book of near-death experiences. Raymond Moody, yes. In his first book, he has a quote from a woman that has come back from near-death experience. And she comes back, one of the things she tells him, and this is, I don't know the exact quote, but one of the things she tells him, the geometry the teachers taught me in high school is all wrong. It's different out there. Well, sure, it's five-dimensional geometry. Now, I happened to find that quote, and I was at a conference, and there were other people on near-death experiences, experts on near-death experiences, and I pointed this out to them, and they say, oh yeah, that's a common statement people with near-death experiences say. Geometry out there is different from geometry. Of course, five-dimensional geometry. We're used to three-dimensional geometry, really. 3- and 4-dimensional geometry. Okay, any questions?
Hope you get your brain.
Yeah, I haven't even applied for a grant in 2 or 3 years. I just, I'll go to the Tucson conference, and I do conferences with the Society for Scientific Exploration, Academy of Religious and Psychical Research, and U.S. Psychotronics Association, and I get up and talk about the same. I'm hitting all levels. The high-level scientists, the low-level scientists, and common people do these venues. And I give talks on this all the time, so I don't think I'll ever get a grant. I've written a book on basically this, on death. And I haven't even got it published yet. I've been waiting for almost 11 months now since I sent it to a publisher who asked me to send it to him. I haven't heard from him. So eventually it'll get out there. If I don't get the grant, don't worry, my ideas are there. Why? How do I know? Because there are patterns in the single field. Eventually, people will catch on. Yes?
I think I have a two-part question.
Go ahead.
As you were talking about the pattern, the storing of memories, I started thinking about long-term and short-term memories. And what is your
some memories would be embedded within microtubules in the axons in the neurons in the brain. It's sort of like you have patterns in a brain already, and that's how we recall. This would be more like long-term memory. This would be more like long-term memory. So you have more of a short-term memory in your brain that connects you with the long-term memory. Now, can I say one other thing?
Yeah.
When I gave the talk on how memory works in Tucson 2 years ago, a Spanish researcher said at first he didn't believe me. Then he talked to some people he worked with, And they told him that Alzheimer's, see, you have little things called microtubulin in the axons in the brain, and they're twisted around like this, little cylinders of tubulin protein. And these are actually magnetic coils, little tiny magnetic coils, like we use in common radios. That's the basis of our radio brain. And he said he didn't believe my ideas until he talked to some people he's working with. They found Alzheimer's, what happens is these deteriorate and crack. They deform, so they can't be radio transmitters anymore. They lose the connection, that's why they lose memory during Alzheimer's.
So their pattern ends?
No, their pattern doesn't end. They can't. This is a mechanical device, electromechanical device. It can't touch the memories. It's lost its short term. It loses its short-term connection here, so it can't connect with its long-term memories that are stored in the fifth dimension.
So
that fits the model perfectly.
So if you get that, and you can no longer, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but with that...
It's like you can't listen to 105.7 FM if you crack a tube or something in your radio. That's literally what you're doing.
So when you die, all of the memory from...
You become your memories. You are still your memories when you die.
But your sickness has made you not able to receive anymore?
Remember I said the mind is connected with the whole body, not the brain. It just acts through the brain. You still got, and some people like to say that, since you have neurons and everything through your whole body, some people like to say that there is cellular memory throughout the body. And there's some scientific evidence of what they call cellular memory throughout the body. That's still connected. You're still there. It's like your higher self up there. Can't get in touch with your lower self in your four-dimensional space-time. There's a block between them, which is the microtubules messing up in the axons.
My other part of my question is, what if someone is a special needs person who doesn't really have the ability to store memory, like you or I would?
They have, I think what that is I think it's just they have something wrong with the brain. They can store memory, but they can't attach it. There's something wrong with the radio. It's like they're getting 105.7 on the dial, and they're actually tuning into 103.7. I think it's like a misalignment in the brain. And I happen to think we're all autistic. Every human being is autistic at different levels, and I consider I'm a mental retard at one level. If I try and do singing, I can't do it. I'm great at hearing and hearing tones, but I can't sing worth the darn.
Right.
But I think everybody's like that. I think we're all in our sense special needs person. So I wouldn't put special needs. We're all geniuses in our own way.
I ask that because I have a nephew who's autistic, and he is nonverbal, and you don't know really what's going on in his brain. But there's... It's
a misconnection in the brain that it's the five senses. It's not the sixth sense that's working. I'd say you may be able to find some way in him if you find out how he may have certain areas. He may be clairvoyant or something, not able to communicate. I also think that people who are schizophrenic are having troubles up here. They're having troubles up here. They're in too much contact. That's why you hear voices and things. And I wish my theory would be accepted enough so they could take into account in psychology and psychiatry, because it would change the way we do psychology and psychiatry for the better, I think. Did you have a question?
Just with reincarnation, what's your theory, or just part of it, that of the consciousness, what makes it come back to physical form?
Okay. Why don't you ask me what our purpose is here, because that's what I'm going to answer. Our purpose is, if you want to know what our purpose in life is, we are parts of the universe. Everything is connected in the universe because everything is part of the single field. So everything is connected. Our purpose in this universe is to learn about the universe. Not just in schools, what I call true knowledge. Knowledge that actually measures the universe, matches the universe. When we become better and better at knowledge of the universe, and I'm talking about experiential knowledge, emotions and such too, not just high school, college learning. Our purpose is to gain knowledge as being part of the universe. So we are actually part of the universe realizing itself. The universe is trying to realize its own universal self, and we are parts of that. So if we don't have enough knowledge to act as independent agents up here, we are in a sense forced by the rest of the universe to come back. In other words, if we don't know that this is true, see, when we're true, this is Buddhist enlightenment. This is Buddhist enlightenment. You break the cycle, you don't get reincarnated. Buddhists say the same thing I do. But if you don't have enough knowledge, you don't know that you're part of this five-dimensional universal self, in a sense. You're stuck to the four-dimensional space-time. You may end up a ghost or apparition. You'll probably be reincarnated because you're still stuck to the four-dimensional space-time. So it's like you set up not a resonance, but a pattern matching that can make that be. That's how I explain reincarnation and the why for reincarnation. I'm sorry, I got another person in here, about 3 minutes, so I'll thank you. If you have more questions, I am available. I am a physics professor here at Columbus. Honestly, I'm a physics professor. But thank you for Physics 104.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
I have to go think about that for a while.
Well, they have a talk like this on CD over there. If you want more information, just get in contact with me. I give you. I publish a journal on the internet. I think you still the journal Fair Physics.
Do you have that?
I don't have the address or anything with me, but just Google my full name, James C. Beichler.
Okay, I have it right here.
Yeah, just Google that or Google Paraphysics, and you'll find my stuff on the internet.
Okay.
James C. Beichler.
Great, thank
Google
you.
even those, you'll find my stuff on the internet.
Okay.
Wow, good timing. My hour tape just ran out.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.